morning. Hope you've had an amazing week as we come to worship the Lord, that you can look back on that and give him thanks for the things that he's brought you through. And in this space, come before him with no defences, a sense of openness to the God who says, come into my throne room with confidence because of what Jesus has done. Let's pray as we start this morning. Thank you so much, God, for the amazing privilege we have to come before you at any time, with any thought or any feeling, any problem, any joy, any wish, and to know that you are there with open arms, waiting to hear and to understand us in a way that we don't even understand ourselves in. Thank you that through Christ we have an acceptance and an access to you which is unparalleled, and we give you praise and glory this morning and worship you. Amen. Amen.
In the quiet, in the stillness, I know that you are God.
In the secret of your presence, I know there I am restored. When you call, I won't refuse. Each new day again I'll choose. There is no one else for me, none but Jesus, crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring him praise. In the chaos, in confusion, I know you're sovereign still. In the moment of my weakness, you give me grace to do your will. When you call, I won't delay. This my song through all my days. There is no one else for me, none but Jesus, crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring him praise. There is no one else for me, none but Jesus, crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring him praise.
but Jesus.
Crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring him praise.
The reading this morning is from Romans chapter 5, verse 12 through to 21. And I'm going to read this morning from the Message paraphrase of the Bible. You know the story of how Adam landed us in this dilemma we're in. First sin and then death. And no one exempt from either sin or death. That sin disturbed relations with God and everything and everyone. But the extent of the disturbance was not clear until God spelled it out in detail to Moses. So death, this huge abyss separating us from God, dominated the landscape from Adam to Moses. Even those who didn't sin precisely as Adam did by disobeying a specific command of God, still had to experience this termination of life, this separation from God. But Adam, who got us into this, also points ahead to the one who will get us out of it. Yet the rescuing gift is not exactly parallel to the death-dealing sin. If one man's sin put crowds of people at the dead-end abyss of separation from God, just think what God's gift poured through the one man, Jesus Christ, will do. There's no comparison between that death-dealing sin and this generous, life-giving gift. The verdict on that one sin was the death sentence. The verdict on the many sins that followed was the wonderful life sentence. If death got the upper hand through one man's wrongdoing, can you imagine the breathtaking recovery life makes, sovereign life, in those who grasp with both hands this wildly extravagant life gift, this grand setting everything right that the one man Jesus provides? Here it is in a nutshell. Just as one person did it wrong and got us into all this trouble with sin and death, another person did it right and got us out of it. But more than just getting us out of trouble, he got us into life. One man said no to God and put many people in the wrong. One man said yes to God and put many in the right. All that passing laws against sin did was produce more lawbreakers. But sin didn't and doesn't have a chance in competition with the aggressive forgiveness we call grace. When it's sin versus grace, grace wins hand down. All sin can do is threaten us with death, and that's the end of it. Grace, because God is putting everything together again through the Messiah, invites us into life, a life that goes on and on and on, world without end. May the Lord bless His word to us today. The disease of polio held a reign of terror for many nations over many decades. And it was a disease that was fear-inducing because it struck without warning. Healthy children would suddenly be crippled. There was no identifiable cause. There was no cure. It left no trace. It just struck without warning. And parents were instructed to keep their kids well-bathed and well-rested. When polio struck in a town or a city, movie theatres were shut, camps and schools were closed, drinking fountains were abandoned, bathing suits were locked away in cupboards, and nobody went to the public pools. And these steps made not one little bit of difference. Fear gripped parents who prayed that their child would not become paralyzed by an enemy that couldn't be seen and couldn't be fought. And so the question for us today is, how many of us wake up each day in an absolute fear of polio? COVID, maybe, but polio? Probably not too many of us, because it is an enemy that has been defeated. And so we cannot really relate to the terror and helplessness that it once held humanity in. Now, perhaps more than 4 years ago, 3 years ago, we can kind of understand it a little bit more because of COVID and all the experience with that disease. But really, the power that polio had was on a different level. And it's not remembered because we have moved beyond it. And while that's a really good thing, we can become so used to our health and our freedom that we take it for granted. That make sense? We forget how precious it is to not have spinal cords that are inflamed. Now, the gift of grace that God gives to us can suffer the same kind of fate, because many of us know it, we've received it, we exist in it, we are fish swimming in it. And you know the old saying, if you want to learn about water, do not ask a fish, because it's all they've ever known. They know no different. And it's a little bit that way for us too. The problem is we are not just to receive grace, though, we are to reveal grace. We are called in life to advertise grace. And how can we advertise something passionately? How can we reveal something clearly when it is so familiar to us that we've kind of lost sense of its true value? Now, for the Apostle Paul, this was an urgent question. And he writes to these house churches living in Rome. But it's also an urgent question for us today as well. Because God, through him, asks us the same question. Do you realize the value of what you have received in God's gift of grace? To help them realize, Paul tells them two stories. Both stories has a hero, a figure who changes the world. And so each of these stories kind of revolves around that figure. But the first story is a tragedy, and its hero, or perhaps an anti-hero, is called Adam. This is the first story. It is a story about an infection. He is an anti-hero because through him a disease came into the world, if we can use that kind of language. Chapter 4, verse 12. Sin entered the world through one man. You think polio was bad? You think COVID is bad? You think AIDS is bad? You ain't seen nothing yet. Now, what's the story about this whole disease thing? Well, when Adam, the first human, refused to trust the one who had made him and loved him and disobeyed his instructions, Adam became like a small hole poked in a dam. And it would soon burst open under the crushing weight of the water. He became like a small pebble rolling down Mount Ruapehu, or Mount Nanahoe, creating a devastating avalanche, building and building as it goes. Adam introduced an infection that went viral. Excuse the pun. Paul doesn't tell us how it spread, this disease of distrust in God, this rotavirus of rebellion against the one who made us. But what he does say is the single point of infection, Adam, led to 100% exposure and contraction of the disease of sin. A bloke called Douglas Moo, a Christian theologian, says this: a critical spiritual condition has been introduced into human history through the act of this one man. Now, many people, as soon as I started using the S word, that sin word, up until that point, I might have had you worry that you may have inherited some terrible disease. But as soon as you heard the disease was, in fact, sin, you may have just breathed a sigh of relief. Why? Because sin is so abstract. It doesn't infect our spinal cords like polio. It doesn't infect our lungs like COVID. It's a construct. It's a religious, abstract idea, isn't it? It's just some kind of weird thing that the church has come up with to keep people under control, right? God or the church made up a bunch of rules, gave the Ten Commandments, whatever. If you don't do ... let's just call it sin, and it's bad. But Paul says, do not be fooled. He says in verse 13, sin was in the world before the law was given. So sin, he's saying, is not about breaking rules. It existed before God gave rules, is what he's saying. And so I guess what is the point of the law? And the law is the diagnosis. Verse 20, the law was brought in so that the trespass or the sin may increase. The law was given to make the disease worse, it kind of seems to be saying. Now, Paul, you've lost me. Why would God give the law if it made things worse? A friend of mine once had a suspicious-looking freckle on the back of her hand. It had been growing in size and growing in shape, and she told me about it because she was worried. She said that she had had it for months. Man, you need to go check that thing out, I said. You need to go to the doctors quickly. I don't want to, she said. He might tell me I've got melanoma, and I really, really don't want to hear that. Yeah. Now, on the one hand, I kind of understand that. To suddenly have it clearly spelt out and confirmed that she has skin cancer, to have all the hope that she was without skin cancer squashed is disturbing. Going to the doctor raises the stakes, but it also paves the way for a solution. And that is what God's law did. It paved the way for a solution. It raised the stakes, it did. It showed things clearly. It showed sin for what it really is. And that really hurt. But the law wasn't the problem. It only showed the extent of the problem. It showed us fully how bad it really was, the situation. The real problem was that sin, once contracted, is fatal in 100% of the cases. And Paul goes on and says the result of this disease of sin is universal death. Verse 14, death reigned. Nevertheless, death reigned from the time of Adam to the time of Moses, even over those who did not sin by breaking a command, because remember, sin predated the law, as did Adam, who is the pattern of the one to come. So Paul is saying death is king in this picture. Right? Now here is the irony. In our modern, civilized, advanced New Zealand society, we don't talk about sin. We don't talk about Bruno. We also don't talk about sin. Because we don't believe in sin. But consider this. Sin is ignored or laughed at by people who lost their parents to sin. Their brother died because of sin. Their body struggles with disease because of sin. Sin is killing us. Sin is killing the people we love. The high suicide rate, the unwanted pregnancies, the drug dependence, the broken marriages, crime, hate, polluted environments, rising seas, armed conflicts, human trafficking is at the end of a long sequence of events that were kicked off by the infection that Adam introduced into the world. Now, I'm not saying, as some people have said, that sin causes earthquakes and sin causes this or that directly. Instead, what Paul later says on in his letter is that the legacy of this man Adam has brought an enslavement to decay into the physical world we live in, to our physical bodies. And we aren't just physical creatures, we are spiritual too, and sin is killing us there as well. It has shriveled the ability of our spirits to connect with the Spirit of God. It seems weird to me that this thing is killing us now, and yet most people don't even believe it exists. Isn't that just so odd, so mind-blowing? The thing that is killing every one of us now, people don't even believe in. We are so used to our prison that we do not see the bars. Paul wants us to see the bars. He wants us to reach the end of verse 14 with a sense of deep despair. Story number 1 is designed to get into our guts and leave there a deep desperation for our rescue. When I was in high school, I had a chemistry teacher called Mr. Strong, and he stood up at the bell and began to teach us about chemical reactions. Lighting a match is a chemical reaction, he said. The reaction turns wood and pink stuff and oxygen and soot and carbon dioxide and other things. It produces the stuff. And he asked the question, can these things be changed back? Can the charcoal and the smoke and the carbon dioxide be reversed? And thinking we all knew the answer, we shook our heads, saying, no, you cannot reverse the reaction of striking a match, you know. And Mr. Strong shook his head and he said, no, you're wrong. The reaction can be reversed. Every reaction is theoretically reversible. But in practice, the energy it takes to do this is simply enormous. And in some ways, that's the kind of idea behind the second story that Paul begins to tell. How do you stop a hole in a dam? Quickly slap some concrete onto it? How do you fix it when the whole wall is crumbling? You know, almost impossible. How do you stop a small pebble rolling down Mount Narahoe? Easy. How do you reach out and hold back an avalanche? The energy would have to be simply enormous. And here is the second story. Paul turns to the second story, the second hero. But the second hero is different from the first. Adam was a hero or an anti-hero only because he failed so spectacularly. But Jesus is the hero of the second story. And he had to be strong enough to stop an avalanche. This hero is truly titanic in a way that Adam never was. Because beyond hope, he can stop avalanches. The phrase, how much more, is dotted throughout the letter of Romans. Verse 15, but the gift is not like the trespass. For if the many died by the trespass of the one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to many? When we see the pictures of Jesus being executed with Jewish fingers and Roman spears pointing at him. That was God, our Creator, hanging there, working to bring our healing from the infection of sin. But do you see, there are two things mentioned. There is grace, or God's goodness, but this grace produced a gift, and this gift is our justification, basically meaning we are made right before God. Verse 16, the gift followed many trespasses, many sins, and brought justification. The gift followed our many sins and made us right with God, is what he's saying. Just a fancy word that means standing before a judge, and the judge saying, I know of no charge that you have to answer to. You are innocent. And this is the story that Paul is desperate to tell. Hanging there, nailed between heaven and earth, this God-man Jesus sucked all of our sin into himself, took it kicking and screaming to death, killing it as he died. He somehow became our sin. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us. And he hung before the great judge of the cosmos who could not be anything but just, who looked down on Jesus and saw in him the full embodiment of evil. And the verdict came down, you are guilty. And in that moment, a way was made for everyone to no longer live in story number one, where the outcome of sin is death, but to cross over into story number two, where the outcome of our made rightness with God is life in all its power. Verse 17, for if by the trespass of the one man, Adam, death reigned through that one man, how much more will those who receive God's abundant provision of grace and of the gift of righteousness reign in life through the one man, Jesus Christ? You see, two stories. Story number one and story number two. Which story are you living in? Is it story one? You know, sin isn't just some religious idea. It's a powerful force inside of you that you know is ruining your life and ruining the lives of people around you and of your world. And you can relate to Adam. You get Adam because his story is your story. In so many areas of your life, you have been twisted out of shape. You are so removed from what you want to be, and you can't help it and you can't change it. And God's hope for you is that, as it says in verse 17, that you receive grace, you receive the goodness of God, the mercy of God to you. And it's there waiting. It's been won, it's ready, it's delivered. But to have it, you must receive it. Are you living in story number two? But the wonder of the goodness of God that you have has somehow kind of got a bit rusty over the years. And you've forgotten what it is you've been saved from, much as we have forgotten the terror of polio. Your healing has become familiar. Can I encourage you to read story one again? To remember the person you were, or imagine the person you would have been if the hero of all heroes had not won the miracle of all miracles for you. Freedom to love God and be loved by him. Which story are you living? May you choose the story wisely and well. Amen.
In the darkness we were waiting, without hope, without light, till from heaven you came running. There was mercy in your eyes, to fulfill the law and prophets. To a virgin came the word, from a throne of endless glory, to a cradle in the dirt. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. To reveal the kingdom coming, and to reconcile the lost, to redeem the whole creation. You did not despise the cross, for even in your suffering you saw to the other side, knowing this was our salvation. Jesus, for our sake you died. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. And that morning that you rose, all of heaven held its breath, till that stone was moved for good, for the Lamb had conquered death. And the dead rose from their tombs, and the angels stood in awe, for the souls of all who come to the Father are restored. And the church of Christ